down now? Yep. But I will tell you that you all like history, because history is not about names and dates. We'll get set up eventually. History is stories. And I have not met a single person in the world who doesn't like stories. Now, sometimes stories have details, and sometimes the details can be a little tedious, but when we focus on the details, that is trivia, that is not history. So this morning we're going to have details, but we're going to try to be focused on the story of the church, story of Christianity. So this week it's going to be early church, and that is, I'm labeling it from 30 AD, right in the beginning, to 330. So about 1,300 years is what we're going to be covering this morning in hopefully 45 minutes. It's going to be very much of a broad strokes, kind of a flyover at 60,000 feet is what we're going to be doing this morning. Yes, his story told through the lives of his followers. I think it's even interesting when we talk about history, and this is not the real word, so don't think it is, but his story, that is history. It's God's story throughout history working among his people. And those are the dates that we're going to try to cover this morning. I'm going to try to focus on what I call the suffering church, or the pilgrim Christianity. The ideas of people who saw themselves as pilgrims and strangers in this world, not the power brokers of Christianity. We're going to talk about the power brokers a little bit, but I'm focusing on those that really followed Christ in a physical way. Let's not mistaken the church for Christians. There's lots of churches around. There has always been lots of churches around. Not all those churches reflected Christ. So let's focus on the ones that did reflect Christ, and the ones that didn't in every way. Let's see how they did reflect Christ and what ways they did not. We're going to really look at the people who are called Christians in Antioch. There is a verse there. It says, at the end of the verse, it says, and they were first called Christians in Antioch. And that should make you stop and say, what? We'll get to that in a little bit. Rather, it's about Christians who just did not remind people of Christ. I mean, there was people who claimed to be Christians who did some very, very wicked things throughout history. They did not remind people of a suffering Savior. They remind people of a heathen empire sometimes. We're going to focus on Christians who took up their cross to follow Christ. In Luke 14, Jesus says, unless you take up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. I have 5 points. Sorry, it might be long this morning. First one is passion, and then persecution, promotion, or the spread of Christianity, preservation, kind of this stuff here, and then the problems. Now, the problems, I ended up chopping most of it out because I was right at 40 slides, and I couldn't put another 10 slides in there. So, some of those are going to be brief. Passion. At Pentecost, we're going to say that it's the beginning of the church. Yeah, you could argue it's actually Jesus' birth. You argue different things. We're going to say Pentecost. And the idea here, and I'm not going to read all this, but the idea is the gospel, or the Holy Spirit enters into Jesus' followers in a new way that they had never been before. Here is the Temple Mount. And when we say in this house, let me go back there a little bit. It says the entire house. You think of an upper room, the private upper room where they had the Last Supper. I'm going to make a claim. I don't think so. I think this is the location this is talking about. We'll get back to that a little bit. There's devout men of every nation that are hearing this, and the sound of them speaking in the language of all these people, there's a big attraction to Christianity there, and it says in the Acts that 3,000 people become Christians that day. This is why I think it's happened right here. First of all, in the house, the language there really would be the language they would use for this area right inside this gate here and up in here. In the house. This was considered the house, and people would have been gathered there. It would have been a place where there's lots of people. So it would have been a very easy place for all his followers to be there. It says all his followers. You can't do that in an upper room. There's lots of people who are following Jesus at this time. And even after Jesus' death and resurrection, there's still lots of people following him. So it seems like this was a place that they were probably gathering. And I think symbolically, the idea is that God's fire came down into the tabernacle in the Old Testament and dwelt in the tabernacle. God's living there, visualized to his people through the fire. And now the fire comes out of the temple and sits on their heads, and they have the Holy Spirit in them. God leaves the temple and enters his people. First time that has happened, that he entered his people that way. So I think this is what it's talking about. But we'll go on, that's going to be a whole mess sometime. Passion. The disciples were first called Christians at Antioch. And the question I have is, what made these people so different that the people in Antioch coined a brand new term to define them? Did anybody ever coin a new term to define you? Or do the terms that we already have work? Well, these people were so different from their culture that they had to coin a brand new term, Christian, to describe these people. And Christian simply means a little Christ, or a follower of Christ. And it's kind of a derogatory term, is, oh, you little Christ. But the disciples did not see it as derogatory. They embraced it because Jesus called them children. Jesus called my little ones. They said, yes, we are little Christ. We are followers of Christ. We are little Christ. This is the traditional site of the church in Antioch. St. Peter's Church is right here. Behind this right here, there's a bunch of little caves. There's little figurines in some of the caves. But this is kind of considered the place that the church was meeting. Now, we don't know for sure, but it's the place that the church was gathering and meeting. And the people that saw these people come here said, these people are different, and they called them Christians. What made them different? I'm not going to get into a lot of details in that because that's not the topic this morning. But they gave to the poor, especially the poor Christians, sacrificially. They went hungry so others could eat. They went around telling everybody about Jesus. They were doing miracles. All the things that Jesus was doing, they were doing. And it made that people look on in wonder. Another thing that happened early on is their response to pestilence and plagues. We had COVID a few years ago, and plagues are not a new thing in society. Not a new thing at all. And they've been around for a long time. And early on, even before these dates here, there were plagues. And the Christians sacrificially gave themselves to care for those that were injured. First one I'm going to talk about this morning is the Antonine Plague. It happened in 165, so roughly 130 years after Jesus. And what happened was the Roman soldiers had went on a conquest, and they got to one town, and instead of fighting, the town people just opened up the gate. The Roman soldiers walked in, and they think that's where they picked the plague. They think that plague first started in that town. They conquered the town, but in a way the town conquered them, because this army left with the Roman plague, probably smallpox, don't know for sure, but probably. And they spread it on their way back to Rome through every town they visited, and spread this plague throughout the Roman Empire. In 150, just before the plague started, there was about 40,000 Christians. Okay, not bad. You're going from just a few thousand, 120 years earlier, to 40,000. You got some growth going on there, but not massive growth. And in a matter of about 30 years, you went from 40,000 Christians to approximately 100,000. And in another 20 years, you got at another 120,000. What is all of a sudden this massive growth? Well, it's due to the way they responded to the plague. I'm not going to read this, but basically this was St. Douglas was actually quoting somebody else, and he's saying they threw their people out into the streets when they were sick for fear that they would catch the plague, and the Christians would take them in. And this was a pagan person who was writing this. The Christians took them in, they cared for them, they brought many of them to Christ, and when the people around them saw how the Christians acted, sacrificially giving their lives, they turned to Christ in droves. The same thing happened with the Cyprian plague, likely measles, right there. By the way, these are probably the three main causes of death by sickness in the last 2,000 years are these three plagues. Again, you see a tremendous uptick of the spread of Christianity during that place. And then the plague of Justinian was probably a barbaric plague. Again, a tremendous uptick of Christianity. And it kind of levels out, and then it skyrockets again at each time of these plagues. So when you think of that, it makes me pause and wonder what would happen if the church during COVID would have acted in this way. Would have we seen the tremendous uptick in the spread of the gospel? Instead, we fought. Many of us fought. Many of us hid. Many of us did all kinds of things. We did not spread the gospel, to our shame. There were other plagues throughout history that the church did not handle this way, and we had a much different result. Okay, sacrificial giving. Heathen infanticide was very normal throughout the Roman culture, except in Athens. So if mom and dad died, the orphans would be kicked out. Many times they would be killed right there on the spot. Nobody's there to take care of them, they just kill them, especially if they're young. The Christians would take them in, adopt them in, and raise them as their own. And that was a tremendous mission to the people around them. And when they did this, people came to Christ. They saw how these people sacrificially gave themselves, their means, everything they had for the poor, for the orphans, and so they came to Christ and followed Christ. James 1 was one of the verses they quoted a lot. Justin Martyr, he was an early writer. I have some of his writings right up here. And he said that every Sunday morning at the end of the service, anybody who had anything extra that week would give it for the poor. Yes, it was the poor inside the church, but as soon as they had enough inside the church, they would find some poor, bring them into the church, and care for it. It got to the point that there was many people who were called loaf Christians or fish Christians because there was questioning whether they're actually following Jesus or if they're just there for the loaves and fishes. It was a term that was used throughout the early church. Another thing that set the Christians apart was their idea of discipleship, and we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, so I'm not going to go into a lot here. But the idea is that we are going to follow Christ in a daily way, in a very much, this is what we are here for, following Christ. And there's a couple quotes or kind of synopsis of quotes. And discipleship is not the idea of we're going to make disciples and then you go follow Christ and we're going to walk away. No, it was the idea of we're going to walk together and train these young people, train the new believers in following Christ in a community setting. Okay, on the persecution. You have a couple of ways of persecution throughout the church. The first one was called the Jewish persecution. Yes, it often used the Roman sword, but I'm going to call it the Jewish to differentiate between this one and the Roman persecution later on. This one was started early on. And I'm saying at 70 AD is when we're going to start saying it's a Roman persecution now. It's not Jewish anymore, it's Roman. Jesus said, if they persecute me, they're going to persecute you. So get ready for it. One thing I find is interesting is out of the 12 apostles, well, 11, because Judas killed himself, they all died a martyr's death, except for, most likely anyway, except for John. And Jesus says when they denied him in the Garden of Gethsemane, and he said, you are going to suffer for me. Only one does not deny him. Who is that? Well, they all ran from him, but when they went into the high priest's house, John followed him through. And when Peter comes up to the house, John lets him in, and the servant girl says, are you also one of his disciples? She already knew that John was. Everybody there in the house knew that John was a disciple, and he said to Peter, are you also one of his disciples? And he denies it, and you know the story, or can read it later on. And John is the only one that dies a natural death. I think there's a link there. Okay, so James is killed by Herod Agrippa. In Acts, you read about that. Paul, you read about his persecutions. The Book of Hemian, I'm not saying it right. Hemian. I can't pronounce it. It's Hebrew. I don't know Hebrew. It's the blessing or the curse. Every time on the Sabbath, you would read through these curses or these blessings. And one of the blessings was, if you are a follower of Jesus, or they didn't name Jesus, sometimes it named James, sometimes that, then you are going to be, and it has a curse for them. And it's actually supposed to be a blessing. This separated the church and the synagogue. Early on, for the most part, the Christians met in synagogues. We often say they met in houses. Well, actually, they did sometimes, but they often met in synagogues. And really, the main reason they met on Sunday was because the Jewish people were using the synagogue on Sabbath, on Saturday. So they met on Sunday in the synagogues. Well, during this time is when the church had to leave the synagogue. They were not allowed in anymore. And then during this time also, during the first 70 years, the church becomes more Gentile. More and more Gentiles are in the church, less and less percentage are Jewish. And so this creates a tension. The Gentiles are eating pork, and the Jews don't think that's a good thing to do. So it creates a tension, and the persecution does happen there. I'm going to say Jewish persecution was semi-light. Okay, so if you read in Acts, it seems like it's really, really difficult. Compared to what they're going to face, it's not that bad. But there is some persecution there. This is where it starts getting tough. Emperor Nero, he's right at the end of the Jewish persecution. He had a friend, I can't see it. It starts with M. I can't pronounce his name. this guy hated Christians. Don't know why, but he despised them. And he was also a kind of a co-emperor under Nero. And he influenced Nero to try to hate the Christians as well. Early on, Nero didn't really care. Who are these Jews that follow, these people that follow this Christ from Galilee? I don't care about it. But over time, every time there's something bad to happen, this guy would come to Nero and said, hey, it's their fault. It's their fault. Y'all get rid of them. It's their fault. Then they had a great fire of Rome. And Nero was under a lot of pressure because many people thought that he started it. Okay? And a lot of people died. About 70% of Rome was destroyed by fire. And he needed to have a scapegoat. And so he blamed the Christians, saying they either set the fire or because they're not following the Roman gods, that the gods didn't protect Rome. And so it's the Christians' fault. And that started a severe persecution. Don't know how many people died in Nero, but it was significant. It was not hundreds. It was most likely thousands. And I'm not going to go into any graphic stories because it might be too much for some people. But he killed them in very painful ways. Sometimes with fire, sometimes sword, sometimes drowning. Very painful ways. And that's what the last one, these were live, by the way. So he would light his gardens and light roads with human torches. Paul and Peter were both killed by Nero, as well as many other followers. The next time, so this is about I'm going to say 70 AD. No, we're going to say lower there. 52 AD. We're going to put 52 AD down. So 50 years after Christ's birth, 20 years after Christ's death. It was in that time period. And then there is waves of persecution. But it's not overly severe sometimes. Sometimes there is no persecution. And then a new empire would come in. There was about 4 waves of persecution that got a little bit more difficult until this guy came along. Diocletian. Probably the most gruesome, the most hideous emperor that the world has seen in the Western world anyway. I'll say it this way. Hitler did not light a match to this man. Hitler just had more tools. This guy was evil. During this time period, right before him, there was a plague. I could have pulled that in here, but there's a plague right before then. And Christianity spread rapidly. Spread through the Roman courts, through the Roman government, through the armies, through everywhere. And then Diocletian came on the scene. And he has observed the cross being made when sacrifices were supposed to be made to his gods. He did not see this as a good thing, and he turned against them. It was kind of a polytheism versus monotheism. If you are a monotheist, meaning you only follow one god, then you're saying all the other gods are false. And he was a polytheist, so he says, you're saying my gods are false, I'm going to kill you. That's pretty much what happened. At least 3,000 to 3,500 died in about 10 years' time. At least. And these were all people who lived in urban areas, because Christianity at this point in time was all urban. If you're in the country, you never heard of Christ. For the first 150 years, 200 years anyway. They were all urban people. There were a lot of people of influence. These were a lot of local mayors and councilmen that died. Councilmen, councilwomen. They did have councilwomen at that time in the Roman Empire. So these are not people that are just a village out in the middle of nowhere that died. These are people that have influence. And that shook the Roman world to the core. Muslim persecution. A lot of times we think about the Muslim persecution. For the most part, Muslim persecution was kind of light. And many times, the Muslims were welcomed into both Jewish and Christian communities because they were battling Rome. And Rome was a persecutor. Even after Rome became Christian, we'll get to that, they still persecuted all the other Christians. And so they often actually did well under Muslim persecution. But over time, as so-called Christians were killing Muslims, then the Muslims started killing Christians too. And I'm going to say that Christians, in quote, have done far more harm to Muslims in the last 1,400 years than Muslims did to Christians. So when you hear people talk about these jihadists and all that thing, keep in mind, I think history would spell that the Christians started the feud. Just keep that in the back of your mind. We're not going to go into the Muslim persecution because we have to go fast. Okay, approach to history. If you live in the West, and the West is like Europe, the Americas, and so on, we have certain ways of thinking through life. We trust history because of the natural or the material evidence. If we can dig up an artifact, then it happened. If we have a book, then it happened. If we have a tower, then it happened. But if we have nothing, we say it didn't happen. It's just a legend, it's just a story, just a fable. The East looks at history differently. They look at history and say, if I trust the person who's telling me about this, then it must be true. Anybody could build a building. Anybody could write something down. It's only true if I trust the person who's giving it to me. So you have this conflict. And when Western people look at Eastern history, we tend to say, it didn't happen, we have no evidence. And when the Eastern people tend to look at Western history, they said, who told you? How do you know that person's trustworthy? So there is this conflict. So as I look at Eastern Christianity, I'm going to try to take their approach to history. When I look at Western Christianity, I'm going to try to take their approach to history. Now, Western scholars are going to look at some things I'm going to share this morning and say, well, how do you know that happened? Well, we don't know, except that it was passed down through Eastern traditions. And I guess that's good enough for me. So we'll approach history that way. Promotion. After the death of James, history would tell us, we don't really know for sure, but it seems like the apostles met together, the ones that were available met together, and they divide up the known world. And then they drew straws or somehow allotted different parts of different people, and they scattered. And in Acts it does say one time that the apostles left because of the persecution. They scattered. Where did they go? Well, this is traditionally where they went. Andrew went up to the southern Soviet Union, Bulgaria. He went up in that area there, Andrew. Thomas has some preaching in as far as East India and maybe China. The China link is probably added on. I don't think the evidence is there that great for that. Philip and Carthage are North Africa and Asia Minor. So we'll get to a map very soon. Matthew in Persia and Ethiopia. Bartholomew in India with Thomas. And then he went over to Africa. So he kind of went across around that way. Simon the Zealot went up over to Persia. And we'll get to that. Matthias went to Syria. John to Ephesus, possibly Great Britain. We know the church in Great Britain was started by people from Ephesus. It's possible John got up there, but more likely it's some other people. And then Peter and Paul, we know that from the Acts, they were in Asia Minor. Okay, here's a map. Here is India. Who went to India? Remember? Thomas. This is how traditionally. Down here is Ethiopia. Here is Egypt. Here is Asia Minor. And then up into somewhere up in here, I say Bulgaria, might not be Bulgaria, but somewhere in the Soviet bloc is where, not Bartholomew,
Thomas?
No, Andrew went. Ephesus is right about there. So this is the area at 200 that probably had penetration from the gospel. Now, it's all green, big area. This is not in-depth penetration. This is, it has gotten there, but most people have never heard of it in most of these areas. It was prominently, for the first 200 years, an urban faith. If you lived in the country, you never heard about Christ. It was only people who lived in cities that heard it. Only people that lived in trading cities, kind of like a port city like Fort Lauderdale or Miami. If you lived in Tampa, you probably didn't hear about it. But if you were in a city that people traveled through, then you heard the gospel. Okay, we're going to look at a couple of those. Roman Church. Here's Rome. Here is Israel. That's where it starts, and it gets up into here. And Roman Church becomes a very prominent church. Roman Catholic Church, as we know today, became a very prominent church and still is. A couple things with the Roman Catholic Church. They became the largest and most influential Christian church, and it still is today. There were many godly men and women in the Catholic Church. Okay, let me be clear on that. There were many godly men and women throughout the history in the Catholic Church. However, the church, by and large, would not have been called Christians in Antioch. Why? Because by and large, throughout history, they reminded you more of the heathen that were in Antioch than the Christians. So, I'm saying that I'm not bashing the Catholic Church. There's lots of Christians in there, but when you look at Christianity, don't just look at the Catholic Church and say this is Christianity, because there's many other examples too. I'm going to say from the time of Constantine, I consider it an apostate church. I'm not going to say everybody in there is apostate. There were many Christians in the church, but the church at its core was apostate. Sometimes it was better, sometimes it was worse, but it was many times not following Christ the way the Christians in Antioch would have. And many of these other churches we're going to talk about at some point in time kind of fell under the umbrella of the Roman Catholic Church. Most historians, when they start counting people, they only count Christians that are under Rome. And everybody else, they say, well, these are heretical churches. They're not Christian churches. And so when I talk of these numbers are not counting people in India or Ethiopia for the most part. Numbers of 100,000 so on. They are people under the Roman Church. A couple of problems with the Catholic Church is the papal authority to biblical understanding. They brought the scriptures and said, we are the sole people who know what the scriptures are saying and who teach the scriptures. We are the protector of the scriptures. And this created a big problem for another church we're going to see in the near future. They unified at 300, or a little after 300. The unification of the church and state was a problem. This did not only happen in the Roman Church. It happened in other churches too, but Rome was probably the worst example of it. And this is kind of me pointing this on here, but the ideology and intellectualism took over the discipleship in the Roman Church. It all became a head thing. What do we believe? Do we believe the right stuff rather than are we following Christ in a daily walk? And that was a big problem with the Catholic Church from early 300s on. Other churches had the problem too, but, and I'm going to have another slide on this one. Constantine, in 306 was when he began his reign, and he reigned to 337. When you would be an emperor that's going to start off, you had to find your pet god. You had to have a god that was your protector. He was in charge of your secret service and so on, and he was your protector. And Constantine had to find a protector. Problem was, some of his favorite protectors were already chosen by former emperors, and if he did not want to kind of be underneath their shadow, he was going to have to find a new one. He did see, he was going into battle, and he says he saw a sign in the sky. It was a sign of a cross, and there was words there, or a message, or it depends there's a couple different recorded events of it, possibly a voice. It said, "By this you shall conquer." And he said, oh, it's the Christian God. He's going to be my protector. I'm going to follow him, and we're going to have a dynasty, starting with Constantine. Constantine started from a kind of non-noble birth. He had noble birth. Yeah, his dad grew up as a non-noble. He was more of a noble. And so he was kind of coming up from nothing, and he is going to start a new dynasty with this God of the Christians. That was right before the Battle of Moravian Bridge. And later on, he gave the Edict of Milan, which proclaimed Christianity to be a state faith and protected. It did not make it the only faith at this point in time, that came later, but you were allowed to be a Christian. This was right after Diocletian gave a very severe beatdown of the church. Only a few years, like about 23 years from the time of Diocletian to Moravian Bridge was only a short time. So less than 20 years. And so you have these Christians who are being persecuted in a very, very brutal way, and all of a sudden they're offered peace. And they took it. They said, we will join your forces, we will merge state and church together, and we will become part of the Roman Empire. And within a few years, Christianity went on to be persecutors of other faiths and of other Christians. We could go into a whole lot more, and I'm going to leave this one because I kind of feel like everybody talks about the Roman Church, and while it's important, I think there's some other churches that are equally important. So if you want to talk about that more, we can talk about that more in discussion time or after lunch, but that's the gist of the early Roman Church. The Coptic Church is down in Egypt, right here. Again, there's Israel right there, and it kind of held the coastline right down along here. It did not get down this far for many years. But the Catholic Church is an independent church. Eventually it did kind of fall under Rome's authority a little bit, but then they broke off from Rome, and today it is an independent Christian church. Started about around 50 AD, so within 20 years of the death of Christ. It said that the Apostle Mark. Mark, do we know his full name?
John Mark?
John Mark, you got it. Apostle John Mark was said to have visited Egypt and took the Gospel of Matthew with him. wrote from Egypt the Gospel of Mark. Or maybe he wrote it beforehand, don't know. But somehow he got the Matthew's Gospel down there. There's some debate on dates here because many times people say that Matthew's Gospel was written about 70 AD, so we don't really know, but somehow he got it down there. In the 4th century, the majority of Egyptians had become Christian. It kind of become a state church again. A little bit the same problem we had up in Rome, it happened down there. And it became underneath the Roman church there for a while. Influence, at least a little bit. In 451, the Coptic Orthodox Church split off from the rest of the Roman Catholicism. And today, if you see a Coptic church, like this one here, this is one down in Miami someplace, I forget where it's at. That's one of the few Coptic churches we have down here. That is a totally different branch than the Roman Catholic Church. Though many of the things that they do would be very similar. They believe in Immaculate Conception of Jesus, but not of Mary. That's different from the Roman Catholics. And their priests are allowed to marry, and they do marry. So there's a couple basic differences that we as outsiders might see between them. If I was going to pick... No, I'm not going to go there. That's not helpful. Ethiopian Church. Again, Israel's up here. Ethiopia is down here. A little bit farther than the Coptic Church. It's getting down into Africa now. What is it? Probably another 1,000 miles or so south. All of a sudden, you have a church spring up in the middle of Africa. Well, why don't we have a church spring up here, or a church spring up here, or a church spring up here? Why is it there? There's a couple of reasons. One is there was a big Jewish presence in Ethiopia. King Solomon and the Ethiopian, the Queen of Sheba, had a trading thing back and forth. King Solomon had his mines down there. I think I talked about that last week. Had his mines down in Ethiopia, and so there was a big Jewish presence. Where there's a Jewish presence, the pipe has already been primed for Christianity to get a foothold. And so the Ethiopian church started up there. Matthew is thought to have brought the gospel to Ethiopian church, probably evangelized among many of the Jews, and then eventually the non-Jews as well. Celtic Church, up here in England, was a very early church. Long ways from Jerusalem, but a very early church. It was some Christians from Ephesus that took it up there, and probably started somewhere around 45 AD. This is only 15 years after the death of Christ. Very early on, they got up there into Britain. Archibus, he's named once in Romans, and he's considered to be part of the 70 that Christ sent out. He's considered the first bishop of the Church of Britain. And while technically they were under Rome, it was always a little bit of a tension. And Rome could tell them what to do, and they decide whether they're going to follow Rome or not. And it always had this kind of a independent spirit there. And that was one of the things that led to King Henry separating the Church of England from the Catholic Church, because there was very little influence of the Pope in Britain. He could just separate the church and decide he's going to be his own Pope. And that's for another lesson some other time. The Indian Church is one that is fiercely debated between the West and the East. Back to the idea of how we view history. The Indian Church claims that Thomas brought the gospel to them. The Catholic Church says, no, you didn't get the gospel for another 300 or 400 years. And so they debate back and forth. You can read on it if you want. They claim that they had the gospel by 52 AD, and that Thomas would have landed right about here and then walked across and started a church there. And there is the Church of Thomas there. It is right there's where they thought he landed. I didn't put the church in there. Okay. There is a church there that is considered the site that Thomas started his church. Today, there is about 18% of Krulas, is the city there, population that is Christian. And these were never under Rome. They never came under Rome at any point in time. It's a totally independent church. Waldensian Church. This is up in the north end of Italy, not far from Rome, which is down here. Again, not that far from Israel. Waldensian means the people of the valley, or the W front came from a V, the valley. People of the valley, and they were started up. Here's another map right here. They would have been down in this valley here. As Rome started exercising more authority, they started getting pushed away due to persecution from the Roman Church. One of the main points of contention was, does the Pope keep the Bible, or is the Bible for all Christians to have for themselves? For the most part, the Catholic Church said it's only the Pope and its bishops that has the Bible, And so they would actually not teach most of the people to read because they're afraid they might get a hold of it. The Waldensians said, no, the Bible is for everyone. And so they translated the Bible into their language, their local dialect, and they taught their children how to read. And at this point in time, for the first 1,000 years, probably they had the highest literature rates of any major group, which is interesting. They really thought high of education. As the Roman persecution got tougher, they would move up into the hills, deeper and deeper into the hills. Eventually, they were kind of joined up with the Reformation, and whatever did not join up with the Reformation was wiped out by the Roman Catholic Church in like the 1400s. One of the things they do, they taught their children to read, and then they would put them in little schools, and some of those schools are still there, not active, the remains of them, and they would copy the scriptures. And then they would go down to the valleys, try to find someone who was worthy, and they would hand the scriptures to that person. Worthy meant they could read, and they seemed like they might be interested. And so they spread the Gospels, especially the Gospels, down into the valleys. It was a really big thorn in the flesh for the Roman Church for a long time. Now, that's one version of history. The other version of history is one you read the most, and that it was started by Peter Waddell in the 1200s. However, Peter Waddell was just a Peter of the Valley who was a noble, and he joined the Waldensians. The Waldensians traced their lineage way back beyond that. In fact, there was a bishop in the, I think 900s, I'm trying to remember what his name was. When he was asked, how did the church start? He said, we always were from the apostles. We did not break off of Rome. We never were part of Rome. And so the idea that they just started in 1200s is probably not quite adequate. There is Waldensian churches around today, but they are not directly linked to this group. This group totally vanished in the early 1600s. Okay, done with the promotion. We're going to preservation. And I'm sorry, I'm running really late. Pre-Nicaea, you have the pre-Nicene writers are right here. That's the early church fathers writers. That's a little bit more than what's considered the early church fathers, but mostly the early church fathers. That was the writers, the pastors, the preachers, the evangelists, the teachers who wrote things down for the first 300 years. Are mostly in there. We probably don't have everything. I know we don't have everything. And some of that there is actually what we consider Apocrypha, which we'll get to in a little bit. The earliest style, the earliest writings are almost, you would think of it as a commentary. You read it and there's so much scripture in there, it just almost seems like you're reading the Bible. As it gets a little later in time, it does have a shift more to thinking and not quite as much scripture based. But they do quote extensively from the Bible. I heard a couple of people say, I've never checked it out, I don't know how you would, but they say the whole New Testament is word for word somewhere in that set right there. So if you lost the Bible, you could recreate the New Testament from that set right there. And quite a bit of the Old Testament as well. I can't prove it, I've never done it. I don't know how you'd even start doing that. There is a broad literary style, depends where they're writing from. Pull up a map. There is two main camps where they're writing from. The one is Alexandria in Egypt right here, and the other is Antioch right up there. And they have two distinct different ways of writing and thinking. And so you will read different viewpoints on sometimes the same passage. Almost all core doctrine, there is widespread, if not unanimous, agreement. But on some lesser things, there is diversion. One person says, you ought to do it this way. The other person says, let's do it this way. So this is diversion. One of the things that we can borrow from many of these writings is it won't necessarily tell you how to do it. It just tells you how they are doing it. And we can learn how the church has done things through those writings. The godly life is probably the main topic discussed. It's not theology. It's about walking daily with Christ. That is the main topic in that writing there. Post-Nicene, after, we're going to say 300, a little later than that, that writing starts to become a lot more philosophical. And that's another whole volume. Well, some of that's post-Nicene too in there. And that's lots more writings. Christology, or who is Jesus, is one of the main themes for that one. I tend to think I put more weight on earlier writings than later writings. I think the earlier ones are better headed, but the later writings do have some good things too. I do not consider the earlier writings more authoritative, but I just feel like there's a different spirit in the earlier writings than the later writings that I think is closer to the idea of discipleship. So I like the earlier ones better. Just my 2 cents. Eusebius, the father of church history, is right here. He has another book too, but this is most of his writings in this one. If you want to get a copy of his, I suggest this one right here because it's very easy to read, and Eusebius is not necessarily accurate many times, and so the author points out inaccuracies when he sees them, and so it just helps to clarify it. So if you just get Eusebius, you read something that I've never heard this is great, and he might say, well, actually, this writer says it a little different. Okay, now I'm going to hold that with a grain of salt. So Eusebius is a great book. It's not difficult to read. It's upper high school level. Couple things. He is pro-Constantine. He was during the time of Constantine, so he's pro-Constantine. He thinks the world of Constantine. He suffered underneath Diocletian, and then Constantine gave him kind of freedom, so he thinks Constantine's a great guy. You read that something there. He's quite anti-Semitic. He blames all the problems that the Jews are having during that time period because they rejected Christ. And some of that may have some truth to it, but he goes a little bit overboard on it. So that's who he is. These are considered the Gnostic Gospels or the New Testament Apocrypha, or there's a couple other words for them. These are books that they all claimed to have scriptural authority, or some people claim they did anyway. They're not really included in here, though some are, including the set. They're not really included in there because many times the writers are not known who wrote them, and many times they would take Peter. We know Peter didn't write it, but somebody wanted this thing to get circulated, so he says, oh, it's Peter's gospel. And everybody wanted to read Peter's gospel. And so they have some flavors to that. A lot of it is questionable, whether it's actually true or whether it's just made up by some dude in his basement writing out stuff. But some of it is pretty helpful as well. So if you read these, take them with a grain of salt. It's a lot of books. It's a lot of books. Okay, you're not going to read it all. Some of them are definitely error-ridden. For instance, the Gospel of the Ebionites, right here. Ebionite was a kind of, I'm going to call it a post-Christian cult, and they had their own gospel. They said, "This is we." Huh? They were definitely off. Muslims came out of them. Okay, just keep it brief. So there's not much value in that book, but there's some others that did have some value. Here is a website, Christian Classics Ethernet Library. Almost all of the old classics are on there for free. You can search them, you can read them. If you want to read some of these books, they're on there for free. If you ever get a chance to get a physical copy of these books, pick them up, because the internet won't always be there, or this will not always be on the internet, and the only way to have it is if you have the physical copy. So if you have a chance to get them, pick it up. I'm not going to tell you to go invest a lot of money into it, but it's worth, if you see it at a garage sale someplace or Goodwill, pick them up. If you don't know what to do with them, give them to me. I'll find somebody. Okay, John Foxe. Foxe's Christian Martyrs, right here. He wrote this in 1563, so it's 500 years almost old. And this is a list. This is stories of martyrs, people who gave their life for Christ from the early days up through the Reformation. That's another book that's interesting. It's fairly easy to read, though it is agenda-driven. He is very pro-Protestant church, so he doesn't take a lot of what he considers Catholic martyrs, and it does. You feel agenda as you read. I read this one as a teenager, and it's a good book, but read it with a grain of salt. Martyr's Mirror. This is one I read a couple years ago. You lift weights with this one. This one was written in 1660. Again, it's Christian martyrs, similar to this one. This one starts in the same place with the apostles, and then it goes, instead of just doing the Protestant martyrs, it brings the Anabaptists in. So this is more of an Anabaptist book. Over half of it is theology, and over half of it, and the theology is talking about believers' baptism is what it's focused on. So you go every century to talk about the arguments for believers' baptism of that century and of the next century, It is tedious. I don't necessarily recommend you just pick up and read it, but if you have a lot of grit, you can get to it. Lost documents. There is tons. Far more than what we have recorded have been lost to history. A couple of places have been lost. The fire of the Library of Alexandria, it had 2 different fires or 3 different fires, and each time it destroyed lots of documents. Sometimes powerful people suppressed some writings, destroyed writings, and got rid of some stuff. Many things are lost in the archives, and they're still out there. just nobody knows where they're at. Okay, there's lots of monasteries, as well as the Vatican has a lot of archives that are not open to the public, and we know there's more books in there. So more stuff will come out. Some writings were in little known languages, or they were in old languages that the current person couldn't read and said, well, I don't know what this is, and so they turn it into firewood. They burn it. Thanks. Some writings were put on parchment, which is dried animal skins. It was parchment, they would write on it, and they survived pretty well, but the problem was that parchment was very expensive. And so some monks later on saw some of these writings and said, can't read that. So they bleach it and then write their grocery lists on that paper. And so instead of having early church fathers, we have grocery lists. Something that's interesting, in the last 10 years, through some X-ray, and I'm not sure how they do it, some sort of chemical way, they are able to resurrect that old writing. And it's kind of like hidden ink. And you'll see documents that pop up that we didn't have before because of this new technology. It's very interesting. Okay, problems. Okay, we're almost done. There were many problems that developed in the 3rd through the 6th centuries and beyond. You have a bunch of councils that started up: Council of Nicaea, Council of Ephesus, Council of Chalcedon are probably the 3 biggest ones, Council of Antioch. Lots of councils work to deal with these problems. And I'm not going into this because this could take a long time to get through the problems. But the merger of the church and state became one of the biggest problems that happened in the Catholic Church as well as other churches. The church became powerful. And when the church becomes powerful, the church stops following Christ. It happens every single time. It happens today. The church becomes powerful, they stop following Christ. Get scared of churches that are powerful. Go for churches that are not powerful. I can't say that strong enough. Deception of affluence. When the church became rich, the church fell away from a poor rabbi in Israel. And churches, when they get rich today, it is bad news. And then intellectualism over discipleship. The church became smart. And we have our professors and we have our writers and our thinkers and our theologians. And when the church becomes smart and they stop following, when they become smart, they often stop following. So the problems, all the problems in church history, you can link to these 3 things. They become powerful, they become rich, they become smart. That's not what the early church was. The early church was intellectual. They did right. They were very smart people, but they didn't think of themselves as smart. They thought God, Jesus, is a smart one. We're just following him. Eventually the church started saying, we're smart. And that was a big problem. The early church had many wealthy people in it, but they didn't see themselves as wealthy. They said, we are following the poor rabbi of Israel. And the early church had many people who were powerful. There's a number listed in Acts. But that power did not become something that they were drawn to. As time went on, these problems happened in the church. Yep, the church became powerful, became rich, became smart. So, what is Christianity? We can define that from the scriptures. Good place to start. What is Christianity? If somebody was to give you that question today, how would you answer it? As we study history, that's one of the things we have to look at. What is Christianity? This is one definition that I've worked at for years. I keep tweaking it. But this is how I define Christianity. The essence of man is found in his creation in God's image. The essence of a Christian is found in the rebirth in the image of Christ. Christianity is not about idealism, personal revelation, theology, or culture. To make any of these essence Christianity is idolatry. Christianity is simply, and here's the definition, Christocentric, Christ-centered, regenerated discipleship. That's Christianity. Hans Degg, an Anabaptist from 1600s, 1500s, said it well. No one can truly know Christ unless he follows him in life. You know, some of the smartest people out there wrote some of the smartest books about Christianity are not Christians. The best resource on the Greek New Testament is Thayer's New Testament lexicon. And he was very clear, I am not a Christian. But he wrote a whole book, as big as this, on the Greek New Testament. It's not good enough to just know a lot of stuff. It's not good enough to be rich. It's not good enough to be powerful. We have to follow Christ on a daily walk. And those who do would be known as Christians in Antioch. Does the world have to find a new term for us? Well, maybe not. Maybe because they found a new term for us a long time ago. In some ways, Christian doesn't mean as much to the world anymore. Maybe we need a new term. I don't know. But if we are following Christ in discipleship, then we become Christians in Antioch. Okay. Are you ready, Fabian? And I have taken up almost all of your time as well.